first approached about speaking at this year's conference, I was deeply honored and excited. That is until I looked at the calendar and then looked at the map. Off the Baptist Health exit ramp, for years, that exit sign alone would fill me with a sense of dread. And give a talk about resilience? Well, sometimes the universe just seems to speak to you so loudly that all you can do is surrender. So here I am. This picture is of my husband John and our 3 oldest kids, taken in 2008, shortly before we moved from New York City to Berryville, Arkansas. From a real booming metropolis of 8.5 million people to a small rural farming community of just a couple thousand. Because you see, John had been really unhappy in his career for some time, feeling compelled to pursue a different vocation, one marked more by hands-on work and service, say, than cubicles and spreadsheets. He initially pitched moving our family to a small town in northern Honduras where we'd be working with orphaned and abandoned children. Now, mind you, we had 3 very small children at the time. So I thought I smartly countered with the idea to perhaps look into his hometown in Arkansas, a place I knew he loved and seemed infinitely more cosmopolitan than the alternative. And so we did, and he relished in telling people then that moving back to Berryville was his wife's idea and not his own. It was a brilliant move on his part. 7 weeks into literally our Green Acres experiment, we learned we were pregnant with our 4th child. Our friends joked that we could basically start our own 4-H club with just our own kids. But shortly after we moved, our dreams of a new beginning, a new start, were cruelly interrupted when a 4,000-pound steel bucket fell on my husband's head while he was doing excavation work. He suffered a massive traumatic brain injury that involved 30 days in ICU, 84 days in acute rehab, and 1 fatal pulmonary embolism. So you see, 10 years ago, this very week, my husband died in the middle of a physical therapy session just a few blocks away from where I stand. I was 31 years old, pregnant, widowed, with 3 children under the age of 5, no job in a state I had just moved to, and now saddled with a $500,000 medical bill. And this is my family today. Sam, Kate, Johnny, now Peter, and my husband Anthony, whom I married in 2016. What do you see in this picture? Armed with just a few brief facts about my story, how do you feel? Sad? Scared? Anxious? Maybe, but you probably feel relieved because you see what most people who hear my story see. You see resilience. And we are, in many ways, my children in particular, a shining example of resilience in the face of unspeakable and unimaginable tragedy. But what I want to talk to you today is about what you can't see in that picture. What's missing in that brief sequence from tragedy to triumph. Something so big that without it, you don't ever fully understand our story. Indeed, the loss, the desperation, the uncertainty, the sadness, the despair, the loneliness, the toxic stress. Of course, you can assume that was all there at some point. But what's missing is the how. How did we get from point A to point B? How did we get from there to here? How did we accept the cards that we were dealt and build a new future? How did we move forward? Here's the funny thing. Most people don't ask me those questions because they don't think they need to. They assume they know what they are because they've seen similar stories with similar endings their entire lives. They don't need to see the mechanisms of resilience to know that they must be the same character traits and action sequences of a familiar script, a script that can be summed up by a story we all know and love, that little engine that could. This story about a little train that overcomes an impossible task just by believing in himself and working hard has clawed its way deep into American culture and benefits from its resonance with sacred American values of rugged individualism, the democratic ideals of equality, merit-based principles of capitalism, and even the basic tenets of reformational theology. All these different systems of thoughts and behavior work together to create what we call the American dream, where rags to riches stories and comebacks are explained by the power of the human spirit, a spirit that is fueled by a simple commitment to hard work, determination, and personal responsibility. The power of this American dream backdrop lies not in how we now can successfully predict the ending of blockbuster movies, but in how it provides Americans with a shorthand explanation for why some people make it and others don't. If you're successful, you worked hard. If you're struggling, well, work harder. As advocates talking about resilience, this narrow formula of success has enormous consequences on your ability to cultivate support for children and adolescents struggling to overcome even harder grief, tragedy, abuse, and neglect. While young children, it is true, elicit strong feelings of care and protection from wide audiences, blame is routinely placed on the action and choices of their parents, with little regard to the environments in which those choices and actions are made. As children get older and their decisions have consequences, we begin to measure our support based on evidence of good decisions. Are they doing well in school? Are they staying out of trouble? Are they refusing to play victim and making plans for a better future? By the time children reach adulthood, this little engine that could script kicks into high gear and becomes the story that Americans tell themselves about how, when, and why we provide social supports to individuals at all. Whether you're stopped at an intersection with a panhandler approaching your window or exercising your right to vote on public interventions, the tension in this script always revolves around the worthiness of an individual, which is largely determined by our shorthand assessments of their work ethic and sense of personal responsibility. As advocates, this can make us really angry, and we often rail against our opponents for seeming uncaring or even greedy, blind to an environment that creates so many vulnerabilities that are outside an individual's control. But we must acknowledge that that's not the story the public is most familiar with. That is not the story that graces the pages of Sports Illustrated or Forbes magazine. That is not even the story that we ourselves tell about our own personal lives. Resilience, as you all know, is not determined by individual character or hard work alone, but rather by an environment that our eyes are trained not to see. So let's put our glasses on for just a second. In this picture of resilience, let me tell you what you can't see. You can't see the workers' compensation policy that covered 100% of our $500,000 medical bill, including funeral expenses. You can't see our financial savings and that of our extended family and friends that covered basic needs, multiple moves, mortgages, childcare, and counseling and therapy. You can't see my debt-free advanced degrees paid for by my parents and grandparents that allowed me to secure a flexible and meaningful job as a single mom. You can't see my financial advisor and my personal attorney working to create protections and assurances that I didn't even know that I needed. And most importantly, you can't see the life insurance that created an overall umbrella of security that minimized our collective stress that we felt as a family and continues the cycle of opportunities for the next generation. Now, for my kids, too, you can't see all the team sports, the after-school programs, the summer camps, and the travel that nurtured their health, their self-confidence, and their independence. No, you don't see any of that. So when people hear my story, they fill in the blanks based on a familiar script of I think I can, success, and resilience. You must be the strongest person I know. And who doesn't enjoy hearing that? Besides, life insurance, low interest mortgage rates, and compound interest don't exactly make for great storytelling, people. But what's the cost of editing those factors from the script of our own personal lives? Well, it's a high one that is carried disproportionately on the backs of people who are already struggling the most. It's a cost that perpetuates the myth that poor outcomes are the consequences of poor choices. It's a cost that demonizes victims as lazy and absolves the rest of us from playing any part in a solution. It's a cost that labels advocates for public interventions as un-American. And it's a cost to the truth about the world we all really live in. Gaps in assets and opportunities, not character, eventually become gaps in achievements and outcomes. Of course, individual choices and actions do matter. But the environments in which those choices and actions are made are more important. Yet these contexts, particularly as they relate to the construction of well-being and resilience, remain invisible, or at best only exist in that background of our dominant frame of individualism that drives our storytelling culture. Stories don't change overnight, but if we are to successfully engage the larger public in our work, we must begin to flip that little engine script and make the invisible more visible. How? First, reframe your own story of success and resilience, and then trigger others to do the same. How people make sense of their own lives creates a mental shortcut for then how they make sense of other people's lives. And it's much easier to persuade someone about something they already know than something they don't know. So start with your own story. What supports and opportunities did you have available to you? Can you share credit for your success in ways that aren't overly apologetic or guilt-induced, but rather brings to the forefront the role your environment played in shaping your life's experiences? And can you have that conversation with your personal and professional network? Getting into the habit of identifying the positive supports that lead to success will help our community better understand how the absence of those supports limits others' potential. Focus on context. Setting the scene is an essential component of any good story. And so in your enthusiasm to embrace storytelling in your work and your advocacy, be sure to zoom out and include a landscape that has so many vulnerabilities and barriers, yet lacks the opportunities to overcome them. Connecting the dots on how well-being and resilience are built is not a radical or even a partisan concept. It makes sense It's just not the loudest story out there, so let's change that. Third, align mission with values. The values of individualism, hard work, and personal responsibility are not going anywhere, nor should they. They don't need to be resented or even replaced, but rather we should demonstrate how the status quo threatens those values. When adverse childhood experiences create such an uneven playing field later on, all Americans lose, for our values are not matched by our reality. And finally, underneath that, it says connect to a larger vision. Now more than ever, as strategic communicators, we need to look upstream and answer the question that Americans are always asking themselves: why should I care? And demonstrate how investments today benefit all of us later. A stronger peer system of ACE initiatives has the power to create safer, healthier, more prosperous environments for everyone to thrive. But we can't assume that those connections are well understood. Focusing on potential of individuals, of families, of neighborhoods, of schools, of businesses, creates a very productive terrain to then talk about solutions. Somewhere I once read that we don't acknowledge or critique systems while we are enjoying its fruits. 10 years ago today, I most certainly could not see how a vast network of systems full of supports and opportunities would bear abundant fruit to me and my family, and so little to others experiencing similar grief, uncertainty, tragedy, and worse, violence, perpetual violence. And yet, I'm held up in my community as a symbol of success, of strength, and determination, while others are marginalized, criminalized, and ignored. Because that's how the familiar story ends, unless we begin to change the script. Thank you so much.